So the question I've chosen is a mixture of subjects actually, and we're going to be looking at history, probably some religious studies at some point. I mean, that's my background anyway. Gender studies, there'll probably be some politics in there somewhere as well. That's kind of the background. It's not a specific subject. At least that's not the way I'm going to take it. So the question we're going to work on today, and the one I'm really interested to look at, is to what extent is feminism relevant today? Now, this is quite a loaded question, I think. And when you look at it, you're like, wow, this is going to be quite a big topic. But don't worry, because we're going to break it down on how to look at this question. Now, the first step is we select the key words and phrases in the question. The reason we look at keywords and phrases is because we want to understand what do these each individual words mean, and how do we understand these words separately and then in relation to the question as a whole. So let's have a look at the question. It says, to what extent is feminism relevant today? And we need to always make sure we keep reading back the question because it's going to help us understand. So let's start with, well, we know feminism because that's our topic today, because that's our time period. And what about relevant? Yeah, that's pretty important because that's what we're looking at. This is what we've got to determine. What else? And then the key phrase in this is to what extent. Now, some of you may have seen this before. It's quite common when you've got an essay for school or university. You might also have compare, contrast, analyse, what else? Discuss. But to what extent? So let's look at to what extent. What does this mean? And we want to look at this phrase. So, how much? Is there a scale? If we're looking at a scale, what comparisons are we making? So we're comparing, contrasting. We're looking at similarities, differences in this topic. What else? I think to what extent, that's okay. You can always add to this brainstorm as you go. Now, let's look at feminism. Now, this is quite a big word. And what I like about doing this, and why I choose my students, why I teach my students to do this first, is because you think you know what you're talking about when you read the question, but time and time again when I'm marking or I'm going through essays or pieces of written work with my students, I find that the first few paragraphs start off okay, and then they start to sort of disintegrate in the middle. There's like a nice point to start the paragraph, but then the rest of it is, what on earth are you talking about? Or you switch topic in the middle of the paragraph. And this is because you don't know what the essay is asking you to do. You haven't come up with your own viewpoint. So we need to understand the words individually so that we can then bring them back together and come up with an overall more in-depth understanding. So let's think about feminism. What do we know about feminism? And you can join in with me on this actually. If you've got some A4 paper, make sure you're doing it with me. Have a go, brainstorm. What comes to your mind? What do you know about? So let's look at feminism. So we know, what about, it's a women's movement. Is it social, political, Then we're looking at, when did it start? And we've got suffragette movement. Movement. I might have spelled suffragette wrong, but that's okay. This is only a draft, so I can correct it later. Yeah, we know it started. Suffragette movement. So, aims. What are the aims? Right to vote, as far as I remember. But then also let's think about, what's the definition of feminism? So I'll put definitions. Maybe, maybe not. Alright, just check that I was still recording this, because the first time I recorded this, it did not record. Alright, so definitions. What is feminism? We've also got, when it started, we've got the suffragette movement, but then we've also had other waves of feminism. We've had multiple waves of feminism, like one, first, second, third, fourth. I think we're on like the fifth at the moment. So then when we're looking at all the difference, like what, why? How did they change? Aims. Like, why did they achieve what they wanted? Did they, were they changing in reaction to something in the environment, whether it's social, political? Why did it happen? But we've also got, so up here I put women's movement, but men? Question mark? Because actually now you find that there are men who call themselves feminists. So where does that fit in? If it was originally a women's movement, if you're thinking back to the suffragette movement, the right to vote, women's right to vote, what's it like now? What are their aims now? What were the aims? Why did they change? So this is all the different things we're going to think about. Then you've got, let's look at today. So today is our time frame. And what is today? Today is, we are in 2019. That's our time frame. Today, is it, we're looking at it, feminism in relation today. Feminism in 2019. And as you could tell, I probably want to go back to the word relevant, which we're now going to do, because this is quite, what does this word mean? Definition. What does this word mean? Well, what words I associate with it? Think of synonyms. So useful. Useful, usable, what else? Relevant. Applicable. And then I've got, is it like all the time? Is it relevant? Some of the time. What about context? Is it useful, usable, and applicable to all people? Or certain groups? Okay, sorry everyone, my writing is getting a bit messy. So my brain doesn't work as fast as my hand can write. Okay, so if I'm just going to take a zoom out quickly, because when you get a bit stuck or you want to think more, I like to zoom out and just look at what I've written already. But here we still want to look at these words as individuals, because again, as I said, like when you look at it as an individual word, you're looking at the full meaning of that word. Now, words are chosen for a meaning. They want to convey a certain meaning. And when you're writing your essays, you will need to choose words to convey what you think in your head so that the person reading will understand what you're talking about and understand it in the same way. Because if they're understanding your argument differently to the way you intended, or they're not understanding it, as the case may be for some, because the sentence structure is badly written or just confused because you haven't figured out what you want to argue yet, you need to pay attention to this. And this is where it starts. So let's go back. Relevant, whether it's useful, usable, applicable. Does that mean all the time? Does that mean some of the time? Does it change depending on context? Is it relevant? Does relevancy refer to all people or just certain groups? Does relevancy change over time? And then I think what's important here is, we've mentioned it a little bit when it's to all people, to certain groups, it's relevant to whom? To whom is it relevant? And again, we've mentioned a little bit earlier when we were brainstorming the word feminism, to whom? Certain groups. If is it women, men, do we separate? Do we keep them together? I'm not sure. Like feminism, who is it relevant to? So you can start to see that this essay, this question starts to link itself together because you've thought about all these different words. So I'm going to start linking it now. And as I'm doing this, I'm actually looking back at the question. I'm rereading it in my mind as I'm speaking, actually. So let's read it together. To what extent is feminism relevant today? So I want from here to look at, to whom is it relevant? Well, to whom is it relevant? How do we define its relevancy? Is it because it's useful? Is it because it's applicable? So if we're looking at that, we're looking at aims, the why. We're looking at why, and how do we define if relevant? Aims. And then we've got like aims, another word for that is goals. Because when we're thinking about goals, aims, we're thinking about how much, how do we measure? So that's another question actually that we want to think about is, how do we measure? Is it like comparing the outcomes of it's not the outcomes of a goal, it's the outcomes of the pursuit of a goal, I think is the better way to put it. is it number of people who identify as feminist? The actions done. What else? So again, I'm coming back to the question as a whole here, and you can see through the blue I'm actually starting to link it together. When we're looking at to what extent and how it's talked about scale here, I'm actually looking at, if I'm going down here, I'm just going to draw a nice big, how did it start? And then I'm going to keep going through that. How did it change? Like, and then how do these, let's not connect, how do these compare with 2019? And then actually today, let's think about it. Actually, before I write that, feminism, who's it for? If it's a women's movement, when we're looking at definitions, who's it for? And then, who's it for today? What do its audience of feminism get or receive? And here we're going to look back at the question again. To what extent is feminism relevant today? So what's this question asking you? Have a think about it. If you've been following along, you can look at what I've put on the screen or your own brainstorm and think, how would you rephrase this question to explain from this brainstorm, from thinking about what you already know, what is this question asking you? So have a pause of the video here and think about it. And think, can you put it into a sentence or two, explaining what this question is asking? So what do you think this question is asking you? So for me, this question is asking me to determine whether feminism still has use today and how much. And again, it might not have use. This question is open-ended for me to determine through my research. Now, for the next video, this is kind of where I'd leave it for a brainstorm. You can do more, and actually this is the page, this is what I use as my anchor throughout researching, planning and writing the essay. I've always found that this page, because it's the first lot of thoughts, it's sometimes much more pure than the actual, when you get into the research, because when you get into the research, you are so busy and there's so much information in your head that it can get quite confusing. There's too much in there. And I find that, going back to this brainstorm, you can get to the essence of what you're trying to find. So again, look back at the question, take a read of it, and in the next video, we're going to look at how we start researching properly, looking at all different types of sources and where you can find them online in your library, etc. This can always be added to. You can always do a new one. You can keep reorganizing. I sometimes would do a first one and then I'd rewrite it neatly so that I could understand what I'd actually written. As you can see, this is quite messy, so I might, when I put this up as a blog post, I will probably rewrite it and make it a bit prettier for you. But we'll see. I may not. Okay, so check out the next video and we'll be talking all about research methods.